Hello, everyone. My name is Stephanie Boozer with CUGC HQ, and I'd like to welcome you to today's user share. We are so happy to have Tim Mangan here with us today. We're going to be talking about best practices for Citrix with AppV. Very briefly go over our format. It is a presentation with discussion and Q&A, so we'd love for you to type your questions into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel, and our moderator will keep an eye on those, and we'll ask some during the presentation and some afterward, but we will try to get to everyone's questions. Also let you know that we are recording today's presentation and it will be posted on mycugc.org within the next day. And you should all receive an email with a link to the recording as well. Moderating for us today is Tobias Kreidl. He is a CUGC Steering Committee member and Vice President. He is a CTP, and you can find him on Twitter at @tkreidl. And I will let Tobias say a few things about himself and introduce Tim.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us today. It's always a pleasure to be involved in these webinars, which are here to help you as the public become informed about interesting and exciting things going on that are related to Citrix. Today, we have the pleasure to have my fellow CTP member, Tim Mangan. He's a co-leader of the Boston CUGC group and co-founder and leader of a vendor-independent virtualization user group in Boston as well. He's also the founder of the appropriately named Timurgent Technologies, that's TMURGENT Technologies, which functions for a very, very long time now as a Citrix partner. And his job is to help enterprise IT people understand and implement, in particular, Microsoft AppV. He's been recognized as a Citrix CTP for many, many years. He's also been awarded the coveted Microsoft MVP for his large efforts to help the technical communities. You can catch his running blog post series that Tim has been doing this year on the CUGC Insights portion of the My CUGC area by looking for the tag of Fieldbook. And so without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Tim Mangan, who will lead us into all kinds of interesting pieces of information surrounding AppV. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Tobias, and thank you, Stephanie. Stephanie, if we could start, if you could put that poll up now, I think that would be great. I want to get a sense from the audience here. Looks like we've got quite a few people here, and I suspect that we have two different kinds of people. Close to enable screen, that's fine. And you know, those who are experts at AppV and those that are here really to learn. I always want to kind of get a sense of that. We'll cover the needs of both groups here. I think we'll probably start with the higher level introductory things for some folks, and then kind of dive into some deep details as we go through the session.
All right, I think that's long enough, Tim. Let me close it out and give you the results.
Sure.
Okay. So, let me see if okay.
Okay. 4060, all right?
Yep, there you go.
Okay, so a lot of experts here. That's great to see. That's great to see. So let me go ahead. I'll bring up the slide deck here. So we'll start here. So I really wanted to start to talk more at that high level, talk about the things that have really the job. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I can see your control panel.
You can see my control panel.
I can.
Okay. Oh, let's see if we can get rid of that.
Yeah, it was
the check mark isn't there.
Maybe if
That's
you
where I'm
minimize it.
Yep, yeah, I'll just get it out of the way. So Tobias is going to take care of all the questions anyway, right?
That's right.
Okay, so you know, what we're really talking about is how, if you look at Citrix's you know, statement of purpose, it's really delivering any app to any user anywhere. And when we do that, we're really talking about a combination of image management, you know, delivering those desktops, as well as delivering individual applications on an as-needed basis. And there's a bunch of different ways that we can go about doing that. And one of the common things that everyone's got to deal with is your basic disk imaging. And the idea is that you'd like to have a gold master image, just have that one copy, got the operating system and the applications that everybody in the company gets. And it would be absolutely wonderful if you could just do that and have a single master and never have to deal with any of the other technologies we're going to be talking about today. But of course, the reality is that you end up having multiple master images because you need different sets for different people. You've got licensing concerns. You have issues with applications that don't necessarily work together well. And unfortunately, over time, you know, you go from this idea of a single master you want to put out to multiple, and then it gets to be a little bit more. And then just over time, it just creeps, and you get more and more of these things. And keeping those images up to date starts to become a real challenge for the enterprise. So the enterprise looks for other ways to deliver the full set of desktops and applications. So one of the ways that's relatively new is to go with layering technology. Now, I'm sure you all know that Citrix recently acquired Unidesk, and Unidesk is out doing a ton of seminars right now to kind of bring those that haven't been hearing that message yet up to speed. But the idea with layering is that you take this master image and then you create these additional VHDs that have an application or sets of applications that layer on. You know, dynamically compose them out at the end user device, where you would, in the Citrix environment, you'd have the VDA installed. And when they do that, there's actually two different ways the technology works at these things. Unidesk isn't completely unique. You also have VMware with their app volumes. You've got Liquidware Labs that are out there in the marketplace. And I'll actually just throw FS Logic into this grouping, even though they're not really doing layering. It's more of a masking technique. But you're getting the same kind of effect at the end. But the idea is that you can dynamically build these environments about what's actually going to get exposed out to the user by combining these pieces together. Now, the VHD technology is the basis of the Unidesk implementation, and it is, on one hand, a great solution. On the other hand, it also introduces some limitations. That means that Unidesk really can't do everything in every application and situation that you're going to find yourself into. So even if you're going to go with the layering type of solution, you're still going to have a need for some type of application virtualization into your environment to be able to get the full mix of all the applications you need. So you're going to end up blending these things together. Now, when we look at Unidesk, there's actually two different ways that these things get brought together at the client side. And one of them is sort of a boot time mounting of the scenario. So you build your set of layers and you indicate that, hey, when the system boots up, this is the layer set you're going to boot with. And then Unidesk recently introduced a more dynamic layering where it gets mounted in at session time. So if you think about a XenApp server or maybe a VDI scenario where you want to have the images pre-booted, but you don't know who the user is yet. And then when the user logs in, you want to bring in that extra layer. So that's kind of a session-based approach that they have that provides a little more flexibility to your deployments. Now, we start looking at application virtualization. This is the way that I would draw that. Application virtualization is really, I mean, it really is another layering technology. We're capturing the application. It's not sitting in a VHD. It's in a different format. And there's a really good reason for that. I'll talk about that later. But we have the ability to individually provide the application. So if we talk about, in the case of layering, being doing boot time layering and session-based layering. This is really sub-session-based layering, where we can have a virtual application and the other processes that we need to have work together in an isolated form so that they see the master image and the pieces they need, but they're not interfered with other versions. This allows us to do some really interesting things like have different versions of the same application on a server at the same time, or applications that would conflict. While we see much less conflict out in the marketplace with modern apps today, there's still quite a bit out there, particularly when I talk with large enterprises that have in-house applications that they built. For a large part, I see a lot of them. If I go into a company with, say, 300 to 1,000 applications in their portfolio, there's a really good chance that at least 10% of them, the installer is 10 or more years old. And those are the applications that have the biggest problems with conflict. But the idea with the AppV implementation is that this is really dynamic delivery on a per application basis, so that we can have different sets and different mixes for different users, and we can intermix them on a XenApp server when we need to. And that's why it's been so popular in working with the Citrix community. Okay. And finally, we can combine these technologies. We can have our master image, we can have the Unidesk layering and AppV, and use them all on the same machine so that we can deploy applications the best way possible through a combination of those technologies. Now, AppV has a whole bunch of stuff you'll see on the screen here about the stuff that we support, but one of the first things you always hear about AppV is that you can't do 100% of the applications, and that's absolutely true. In fact, there isn't any deployment type that'll do 100% of your applications. You can't do it through master imaging, you can't do it through layering, you can't do it through configuration manager on top of your imaging as well. All of these, as well as AppV, have problems with certain scenarios. And the good thing is we've got lots of choices these days. So no one is really trying to do everything 100% through a single method. Now, in the case of AppV, the big things that we can't do are the things that would go into, let's say, a Unidesk boot layer. That would be things like things that have device drivers. I don't really see much COM+ and DCOM out in the marketplace, but yeah, those are a problem for AppV. We don't do those apps that way. Things that have or that have scheduled tasks, which, quite frankly, for the most part, are the auto updaters that you're probably defeating anyway. But if they're important to you, that's not a great application to do with AppV. Now, in the end, we can still do 100% of the apps with AppV. I'm not going to tell anybody to go do that. But with the scripting that we have in AppV, we can take anything that doesn't quite work right in AppV, and we can do package scripts that do, in essence, what SCCM would have done for you, except that the end user doesn't have to wait around 15 minutes for SCCM to get around to installing it. AppV will do that right away as they log into the system. Now, what are the components of AppV? Well, the primary component that you need to worry about is the AppV client. This is a piece which in the past has been a separate download, but as of last summer in Windows 10, Build 1607, the anniversary update, as well as in Server 2016, Microsoft has now embedded the client directly into the operating system. So when you install your operating system, if you're an enterprise or education SKU customer, the AppV client is already in there. Now, we still have the separate installer because you've got a lot of Windows 7 out there. You've got some Server 2012 or 2012 R2. So that installer is still available and is being maintained as well. So you're still covered, but in that case, you actually have to go ahead and install something. In terms of licensing, this is the piece of AppV which has been the piece that has to be licensed and would cost money in the past. So in the past, the license for the AppV client on RDS servers was built into the RDS CAL, so you didn't have to worry about that one. But for the desktop operating systems, you needed to have MDOP, and that was the big component that would keep a lot of customers from going to AppV. They didn't want to pay that extra tax. Well, Microsoft has changed that, and they've really, in essence, eliminated MDOP as a paid-for product, and now that's just part of your enterprise EA. So as long as you have an enterprise agreement with Microsoft, now you're covered for the AppV client. So AppV at this point is pretty much free for you as a Citrix customer. Now, at the back end, you have some options. At a minimum, we're going to have a place that we put the AppV packages and store them. Beyond that, you can use an AppV Server. Now, the AppV Server is more of a traditional piece. It's the original way that we deployed AppV, and we didn't have a bunch of other options available to us. And a lot of customers are still using it, but you don't really need the AppV Server. As a Citrix customer, you would only use the AppV Server if you were still servicing 6.5 farms, or if you were also deploying to physical desktops and weren't going to use the SCCM connection to do that. Now, SCCM is also an option. You can use SCCM to deploy AppV packages much as you would any MSI. If you do go with the AppV Server, Microsoft has this horrible looking drawing that shows you the way that things should be deployed. And it would have like 50 different boxes on this screen other than the one I'm showing you here. But this is really what we implement out at a main site of a customer implementing AppV. We take a VM or a pair of VMs, and on each of the VMs we install the management and the publishing server components together, and we load balance those two pieces. We'll have our AppV clients, and there's a small database at the back. It's not very big. It doesn't get much activity. And that's really it. The clients will talk to the publishing server and find out what applications are assigned to them. And then from then, the client will go to that file share and bring down the packages, streaming them down as they need to. Now, I put two machines on here because anyone who's going to implement, of course, is always going to have some redundancy in place. But if you do the scalability exercise, I looked at the number of people on the call here. Even knowing that most of you are larger enterprises, I'm guessing that a single VM could actually meet the performance requirements for all of your companies if you were deployed AppV. So it's really not a scalability thing. We put two in there just for redundancy. And even if they both go down, things don't really break down. The clients already have their applications. Now, if I do multi-site out at the additional sites, what I really need to do is replicate that storage of the packages and make them available out at that site locally. That's just a good idea from a performance perspective. You want to have that type of replication there. You can use DFS, you can do robocopy, you can have somebody manually copy it after they put a package in the share. It doesn't really matter. You just want them out there. So at the branch site, you'd have that storage share, and then you'd have the clients. Now, I've drawn a publishing server in here, but the publishing server is really optional. You really need to have a pretty good-sized site before you think about putting the publishing server in there. In this scenario, with the AppV server, the clients would normally just go directly to the publishing server at the main site because it's just a small amount of traffic. In essence, one web page lookup when the user logs in is all it takes for that communication across there. But, you know, as you start to get more and more clients out there, it can start to make sense to put that publishing server there. I had a customer that had me do a design for them where they were doing manufacturing around the world at a lot of places that were islands that were subject to hurricanes. So the design that I have here on the screen is exactly what we ended up doing for all of those branch sites where they were subject to hurricanes. If the communications with the main office went down because of a hurricane, it's probably going to be down for a week or so. And as long as they have the materials on hand, they want to be able to continue that manufacturing. And that's all they really needed was to have a publishing server on that site. And quite frankly, the only reason they needed that publishing server was because they may have new employees that come in from the main company that walk into that site for the first time, and they would need some applications. Anyone else that already had the applications, they wouldn't even need the publishing server to be there. So as we start talking about integrating AppV with Citrix, Citrix has done a lot of great work to make that integration a lot smoother than it was. So starting in 7.7 of XenApp and XenDesktop, they integrated AppV directly into the console. So prior to that, we would stand up the AppV server, we'd have AppV deliver applications, and then we would go into Studio in the case of the 7. Series and add in the applications as if they were natively installed there. Starting in 7.7, Citrix did an integration with the AppV server so that it would talk with the AppV management publishing server and know about the applications. So Citrix refers to this as dual admin because if you were rolling out a new application, you'd first go to the AppV Server and add it and publish it there, and then you'd come into Studio and do a refresh with the AppV Server and then add that application into your delivery groups there. In 7.9, they introduced the single admin version, and this is the version that the single admin is the way that I would be recommending any Citrix customer implement AppV at this point. So in 7.9, they introduced a direct integration where we would just point to those packages up on the package share. So there's no need for an AppV server. The only problem with the implementation in 7.9 is that it didn't support what we refer to as connection groups in AppV. So let's say you want to have 2 or 3 different applications packaged separately, but have them work together as if they were a single virtual application. We refer to that as a connection group in AppV. And in 7.9, that single admin didn't give you that capability. So that finally came along in 7.11, although they renamed it as isolation environments because the implementation is a little bit different, but it gets you the same effect. But as long as you can get to 7.11 or beyond, you now have a very effective way to use AppV in your Citrix environment. You just go into Studio. We'll show you how you do that. And then you are going to add the applications in. Now, if you're going to use the AppV Server, when you set yourself up in Studio, you're going to tell it that you want to be using the AppV Publishing, and you'll come in here and put in the addresses for both the management server and then the publishing server. Now, when you do that, remote PowerShell has to be enabled on the AppV server, because what's happening is Studio is going to go use PowerShell remotely into the Microsoft API on that management server to find out about all of the packages and gather the information about what the applications are that are available from there. The publishing server information we put in here, Studio doesn't actually talk directly to, but it provides that information to the VDA later on so that the VDA can do its job. Now, if you're not using the AppV management and publishing server for the integration with Citrix, you simply do not add these entries in at all. Instead, what you'll do is you will manually go and point the packages and add them to what Citrix calls the AppV library. So once you've done that, either with the dual admin approach, where the AppV server has been registered and Citrix automatically finds out about those packages, or if you've manually added the packages in one by one, as you bring them out, instead of putting them in the server and just use one console to solve the problem, they'll show up in your application list kind of like this. So as you add an application and create the new application, you'll get a choice there. Is this something that's on the master image, or is this something that comes in through AppV? So you just say it's through AppV and then pick your package. And after that, you treat it like any other application. So under the covers, how does this end up work? Okay, there's one more thing I need to mention first, which is that when you go to roll it out this way, when you go to install the VDA on your machines, you really want to make sure that the AppV client is installed or enabled before you install the VDA. That's an important direction piece because the VDA will detect that the AppV client is there, and it's going to add in some extra components, which is what I'll talk about next. So that means either on the older operating systems, you're installing the AppV client on there, or on the newer operating systems, you're running a PowerShell commandlet called enable-appv that turns on the AppV client that's native to the operating system now. So what does this do when you have that combination? Well, the difference for the VDA is that it adds an API for integrating with the AppV client on the machine. It also adds a local account and a COM server, which is using that local account, which allows the receiver VDA to, not the receiver end, but the VDA end, to be able to do the work that it needs to do with the AppV client without having to have UAC prompts and things like that come up. And there's this component called CTX App Launcher, which becomes part of the process here as well. So here's a view of kind of how it looks. So the stuff in the purple box, circle there, or whatever shape that is, that's the stuff that comes into play only when you're integrating with the AppV server. So if we look at Citrix Studio here, as you run Studio, and if you've registered in a management server there, their SDK is going to talk that remote PowerShell out to the AppV server and find out what those applications are and then bring them into your Studio interface. If you're not doing that, then you're just going to use Studio and you're just going to point directly to the package share and say, this is the AppV package that I want. As the user then gets those applications, they go to Storefront, they launch an application. The broker is going to communicate with the VDA, and the VDA is going to be told what it needs to do in this case. So if it's a direct integration, that VDA is going to communicate with the AppV client, and it's going to run the PowerShell commandlets that AppV provides to add and publish that package. And once it's done, it will then launch the application. Now, the component that's doing all that work is that CTX App Launcher that we saw on the previous screen. If we're integrating with the AppV publishing server, what the VDA will do is it'll communicate with the AppV client. It will tell it where the publishing server is and get it configured, and it will then ask the AppV client to do a publishing sync with the AppV server, bringing down all of the packages assigned to that user, and then it'll launch the application that you need. Now, if you're doing everything through published applications, this is one of the reasons you really don't want to use the AppV publishing server, because you don't need to sync all of those applications. You really only needed to sync the one application the user was trying to run at that point. The user goes and launches another application in Storefront. While that application is up, it'll simply come back through the VDA and then bring that second application in and launch it up. So it's a much more efficient way of getting the job done. Now, Citrix, quite honestly, has had some problems with the CTX App Launcher, but it looks to me like in 7.13, they've really got the problems fixed. I know a lot of people had to go to some private patches from Citrix due to some syncing options, operations that they were seeing in the past. But it looks pretty rock solid to me at this point. So the AppV client itself does need to be configured. It's not just hitting that PowerShell enable. We highly recommend using a GPO. You can download the ADMX from the TechNet site for the AppV client. And the three things that you want to, the two things that you want to set here is, one, you want to enable package scripts. That's just something eventually you'll be doing some type of scripting with AppV, so you might as well get that turned on right off the bat. And for anything that has a VDA, you're probably inside the data center. And if it's inside the data center, we want to enable the shared content store mode. So shared content store mode says that when the package streams bits down to run this virtual application from that content share, don't write it back out the disk. And when you're inside the data center, that's a much more efficient operation. You know, we don't need all those extra write IOPS. So we always want to be turning that on. Now, we don't turn that on if we're talking about AppV clients that are out on the floors outside the data center, because we want to make sure that we're at reasonable latencies for that connection. And also, if you're doing the single admin mode with Citrix, you do not want to include the AppV publishing server in that configuration yourself, because Citrix is going to take care of that for you. If all of the apps are going to be provided to users through published apps, so there are no published desktops in XenDesktop or XenApp, then I also recommend disabling dynamic virtualization. So dynamic virtualization brings in some extra feature sets with AppV, such as shell extensions and browser integrations, browser plugins, and ActiveX components to dynamically come into Internet Explorer. So you probably turn that off and save yourself a little bit of performance on the server with that. For those who are using PBS, one of the things that we recommend is that you configure the AppV package cache. Even though you're not caching a lot of stuff with shared content store mode, there is a little bit that does need to get written in that. And we don't want to overfill the PBS write cache. So what we do is we place that on a secondary drive that's a persistent drive. And when we do that, it's a lot like the way the old Citrix application streaming worked. When you reboot the machine, all of that information will remain on that persistent drive, but there's all sorts of stuff in the registry that went away. So as a result, as part of boot up, we need to have a cleanup script that removes that package folder from your D drive, and it'll automatically get created by the client for you. So the part of setting up packages and getting them ready for delivery, we refer to as sequencing in AppV. So this is the packaging aspect of that. And when we do that, what we do is we use a virtual machine, and we'll use a very clean virtual machine. So even though you have a standard image that you deploy to desktops around the company, we prefer something that looks very much like the original operating system with maybe some service packs. And quite frankly, I don't even care if you put the hotfixes on them the way that we use this thing. So you basically install the OS, shut it down, and take a snapshot. And that's what we're going to use. We're going to boot that thing up. We're going to start up this thing called the sequencer. We're going to install and capture and customize the application that you want to use. And then we're going to take that capture, put it up on the network share, and then revert that VM and put it back to where it was. The reason we want to have as clean of an operating system as possible is it really helps us solve some of the problems that happen down the road with packages as your master image changes, right? So if you look at Unidesk, they have the ability for you to layer, and they have you layer on top of the master image typically that you currently have. And in general, you can kind of update that master image over time and their layers are still good, but there are times when that's not going to happen. And that's why when you do update the master image with like the security fixes from Microsoft that you get every month, you still need to test every one of those combinations of the layers with that new master image and make sure it works properly before you go to production, because every once in a while there's going to be an issue there. And we do a very good job with AppV of minimizing that by not using a master image that has a lot of stuff on it. So we have as little as possible. And as long as the master image in production is adding things rather than possibly removing something, that just plain works. The other thing that we can do with AppV that we really don't get in the other technologies is the ability to sequence on one kind of operating system and deploy on another. So typically, I'm always sequencing on Windows 7 machines today for the enterprise. I can deploy on Windows 7, I can deploy on 8, I can deploy on 10, I can deploy on any of the server operating systems with that same package. And if I sequence a 32-bit app on a 32-bit operating system, I can also deploy that to a 64-bit operating system. And that's part of the magic of what AppV is doing. When it's doing the capturing, it's not simply a VHD layer. It is a captured layer that has all sorts of markers inside it variabilized. So locations like when I install that application on a 32-bit machine, program files, becomes a variable that says, hey, whatever the local machine's program files is for 32-bit programs. So if I deploy that package on top of a 32-bit machine, it'll look like it's C program files. If I deploy it on a 64-bit machine, it'll look like C program files x86, and it will work. And it works really well that way. Some of the other best practices that we have, those of you who are more familiar with AppV on here will understand the terms VFS and PVAD. And this has to do with how we install the application. We do PVAD installing, we install into a special folder. We do VFS style, we install into the standard place the application would normally install. In the very old versions of AppV, the PVAD style was the recommended approach. And we've really changed that over the years. In the last 3 years, Microsoft has made a lot of very good fixes into the product. And our default now is to always install into the VFS unless we need to do otherwise. There are, at this point, I think about 10 or 11 different applications that we found that we need to do a PVAD style install. I've got a blog post on my site at tmerchant.com. That if you go to the blog and just query PVAD, you'll see that post. And I just maintain that with the list of apps that we've found so far that require the PVAD style sequencing. The other thing that we use is a free tool that I have up on the site called AppV Manage. And this has really become an important part of the tool chain for working with AppV. And it's part of what I really think makes AppV a little bit special. So AppV Manage, the idea here initially was simply to simplify that early test effort that you need to do. So after you've done sequencing, you go to a client machine, you don't worry about any of the server infrastructure, you just have that thing, point to the package, bring it into play, and let you test it quickly. And over time, we've added a lot of testing tools in there as well as analysis. And that's part of what's starting to become really interesting is the analysis that we're now doing on here. By taking a look at the package, not the way like something like AppDNA does, where it's looking at the installer before installing, but looking at the actual impact of what the installer did. We can do some interesting things. I really like to pull out and understand from an application, where is it integrating with the operating system, where is it integrating with the user, where is it integrating with other applications, and we can fine-tune that application and make it better. The work that we've been doing in the last year has been now to take some of that information and start pushing out some scripts to make the installation process better. So applications that don't do a good job of optimizing for .NET, this tool now, you can push a button, it pushes out a script. Now I could have fixed the package directly, but I decided to go with this approach of actually producing an external script that you would use as part of a repackaging effort. So we can improve that. We can improve the problems that we see with file type association conflict, where applications want to own a file association and not play well with the default programs the way they're supposed to do. So we'll produce scripts for that. Now you can have your normal install that you did before, run these extra scripts, and you'll have a package that works far better. We're actually kind of getting to the point where it doesn't even really matter if you're going to deploy this through AppV. It might make sense to go ahead and sequence it, get these improvements, and understand your application so much better. And then if you decide you want to deploy that through the master image, through layering, through SCCM, it doesn't matter. You'll have a better package and you'll have better information about that package moving forward. And the last thing we added is a debugger. There's a debugging environment in there that combines the best of Process Explorer, Process Monitor, Event Viewer, and Xperf, all in a simple, easy-used tool. So you just point to your package, it'll pull out the shortcuts, you say, okay, I want to launch this thing in this monitoring mode, and it kind of combines the best of all of that information so you can get an understanding of what's going on wrong here. So again, this is a tool that you use just during the smoke test period. At that point, you deploy to the server, publish it out to your application expert, have them look at the package, and then roll it out to production. I did want to pull out some resources that I've talked about here, so I've got a slide here. One of them, this is my blog. So if you are new to AppV, I have a series of 4 posts that are in here, and that's the particular link I've got there with page 2482. That's the first of 4, and those posts are all linked together. That's sort of a, okay, I'm new to AppV, how do I get started kind of thing. Probably a good thing to look at if you're new. Tobias mentioned earlier on mycugc.org, and I finally figured this out. You have to actually log into the site first, and then you've got this little search thing here. You hit that and then type in Fieldbook. You'll get the set of those. So I started this at the beginning of January, publishing these out on an occasional basis, and I've got another 4 or 5 that are in the can right now, and I'll just continue with additional ideas from things that I've seen in working with customers in the field and trying to integrate Citrix and AppV together. Another site I'll mention is appvertguru.com. A lot of people don't know about this site when they first start to get into AppV, but this is the traditional site for community sharing around the AppV community. There are a lot of people who post very good information out on this site as well as other sites. I think AppV is one of the really nice things with AppV is we've got a good community and people are very willing to share. So if you're struggling with a problem, you really want to go out and search on the term AppV and whatever the application is you're working on, and you'll undoubtedly find someone else who's already felt your pain and they've probably already figured out the problem for you. So I would encourage you to do that. And of course, the eDocs at Citrix, there's some good information there in terms of getting your systems set up and integrated with AppV. Okay. That was the slides. And I was going to actually go live into the Citrix Studio environment, but there's something wrong with my controller this morning that I need to look at, so we're not going to do that. This is the AppV Manage tool that I talked about, and just to kind of quickly show you how we go through that process. So you would just kind of come into the client, you'd pick your package. We've got this new simple UI mode now that then runs this package through the paces. As we sequence the application, we don't use antivirus. So this integrates with your local antivirus system it adds the package into the client, does a full load, and it scans that package to be sure there's no way that you caught anything up front. In this case, I'm using Windows Defender, so it said, okay, I've checked the package out for you. This is the analyzer. This is a multi-page thing here. I see a little yellow here, which in this case is going to mean that there's some executable in this package that would require a UAC prompt if somebody ran it. Now, in this particular case, what we're going to find is, it should be in this one area here, is this was the uninstaller. So somebody didn't remove it from the package. So I'm not really worried about it in this case, but that's the kind of thing that we're looking to do with these. There's the one here. Does this have one? Okay, so this is the case of an application that doesn't play well with others. It wants to own all of these file associations. And so this is where I would come in and generate that script file. So now I've got a PowerShell script that I can run after the main install, and it'll actually do the job correctly of setting up the various prog IDs and the registered application registrations within Microsoft. And then as we go in and we want to launch the application, I mean, at this point, the package is added. I can just go to the Start menu. So when I do that, just show you my virtual application that I added with that first button. Okay, there's our 7-zip. So we can just go ahead and launch it. But if something had gone wrong, that's where we would use these debug tools in here, where we could use a regedit inside that virtual environment to take a look at what the application is seeing, or the runtime analyzer, which is here, which we can launch, which brings in all of those tools that I talked about in terms of a little bit of Procmon, a little bit of Process Explorer, and the like. In this case, of course, the application is working just fine, so there's not a whole lot to see here. So at this point, what I'd like to do, Tobias, we have some good questions.
Tim, we have a plethora of questions.
I had a feeling we might.
Yeah, I would guess around maybe 24 or so. So we'll try and get through as many as possible. For the ones that we may not get to, there is always, in conjunction with these CUGC webinars, a Q&A area that will appear once the broadcast has been published to the CUGC site, and these discussions then can be continued. So yeah, starting at the very beginning here, there was a known bug with the targeting package property in AppV manifest, which made the publishing of apps that need to use that attribute virtually impossible, at least in some versions of SunApp. And so the question is, have you ever experienced this problem or have any knowledge regarding the issue or possible workarounds for it? And then there's a link to one of the Citrix discussion forum sites.
Okay. I'm not entirely sure what the question is about, but if I were to make an assumption here that when they're talking about targeting, what they're talking about is when you sequence a package, you can identify operating systems which that package is allowed in, and then that's probably what they're referring to as targeting. As a general best practice, I discourage customers from ever using that. Okay, the idea behind it was, let's say, a couple of years ago, you're packaging on Windows 7. The way that a customer would use it is they would mark that to say, okay, this package is allowed to run on Windows 7, but they don't mark Windows 10 because Windows 10 is not in that list. And the reason they want to do that is they want to make sure that as they go to Windows 10 that they actually test that combination before they release it out, in which case they'll have to go back in and touch the package to change that marking. For the most part, I discourage customers from doing that because it just ends up causing them more work later on. You're going to do the testing as part of rolling out Windows 10 anyway. Just go ahead and leave them completely unmarked, and then that targeting isn't a problem. So if that's what they're talking about, that's my recommendation is you should be removing those from your packages. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Particularly if you think that Windows 10, according to Microsoft, is going to be the last version of the operating system.
Right. Okay. Here's another one. What can you do to address limitations in sequencing apps that are not by default destined to do the installations on the C drive? For example, if they point to a D or an E or other drive.
Yeah, that's a limitation of AppV at this point. It will capture the things that go to the drive that Windows is installed on the sequencer. So if we're talking about something hard-coded inside the installer itself that says, I always will go to D no matter what, we could build a VM image with Windows installed to D, and that would actually solve their problem. But that's not always the case of what they're talking about. Sometimes it's they need to have a mounted drive, and it's putting things into that mounted drive. And in that case, we really don't have a great solution for that with AppV. I have done some things where we would use junction points instead of the mounted drive, and then with a script within AppV, as we add the package in, then we can kind of recreate that junction point to wherever the mounted drive is on that actual client. And that's a possible workaround for some of that stuff.
Okay, here's a really good general purpose question. During the VDA installation, there is an AppV option which crops up. Is it required to install this feature if you already have an AppV server in place?
Okay, so yes, it is. Assuming you want to use AppV through the Studio integration at all, no matter which method you're using. If you have an AppV client in place, then you have to have that integration because that brings in that special account, the CTX App Launcher, and that whole integration to make Citrix drive the apps being brought to that machine. Now, if you don't want to do that, if you want to go with more of the traditional style implementation, the way you would have done with 6.5, right? You can do that, in which case you can, you would want to not include that integration with the VDA. So you would, in that case, have to have an AppV server set up. You do all your publishing there, and then when you go to do the publishing in Studio, you'd have to point Studio to a machine with that package cached to it to point to the executable that's your application. And Studio would believe that it's a native application at that point. And then when the user logs in, AppV is going to do its job of making sure the pieces are in place, and Storefront will just be launching the native application that happens to be virtualized.
Great, thank you for that clarification. Next question is HTTP still a supported or recommended package streaming method as opposed to DFS?
Okay, and I would have said CIFS instead of that, so it's HTTPS or CFIS.
Right.
It is supported, yes. It is not supported for Citrix, however. The Citrix implementation assumes it will always be a UNC path integration there. If you're doing the direct integration. If you're doing the dual admin mode, then you can go either way. In terms of the recommendations there, basically there are some people who feel that HTTPS streaming is superior from a protocol standpoint due to some tests that they've run. My feeling is those tests are flawed, and for every test they run showing it's better, I have a test that shows it acts worse. And my feeling is all you're doing is adding another component that could possibly fail in the chain of application execution. So I prefer not to use HTTP streaming. The two cases that HTTP streaming makes sense is when you have end users with AppV clients that are outside a firewall and you don't use a VPN in any form. So you want to have them have access, but you're not going to open up file shares through your firewall, so you have to use HTTPS for that. The other scenario is an SCCM scenario where HTTP streaming can make some sense. Although even there, I still prefer bits unless the clients are very disk challenged, because you end up with an SCCM cache and an AppV cache in that instance. Those are the only cases that I see HTTPS being used.
Great, thank you. Do you need a publishing server to be able to publish to Active Directory groups? With PowerShell, you can only publish globally, where FTAs, BHOs, and etc. affect all the users.
Okay, so first of all, some of the information out there regarding the requirement to do global publishing is outdated. And unfortunately, I wish we had an accurate list of what needs it, but some of the stuff that used to require global publishing doesn't anymore. So I do want to throw that out there first. Oh, could you read me that question again, Tobias? The beginning of it.
Yeah, of course. It is, do you need a publishing server to be able to publish to Active Directory groups?
I'm not sure how to interpret the question. Do I need a publishing server to be able to, well, okay, well, no,
I guess what he's saying is that, you know, if you use like PowerShell, you can do this through, you know, alternative methods as opposed to using the publishing server directly.
Right, and there are, and you certainly can use, there's a tool called AppV Scheduler that acts as kind of a replacement for that publishing server that some companies are using. I have a free tool called AVSS that allows you to set up the application groups there in Active Directory, and it simply adds an additional service to the same machine with the AppV client, so there's no other back-end server in that case. And basically it just uses a technique of looking at the package name and looking to see if it can find an application group in AD with that same name and figure out whether or not, you know, the user of the machine is authorized to get the package. So it does it through that type of thing. So you can always do that. And if you're doing the PowerShell yourself directly, there doesn't need to be anything in Active Directory. You just need to make that decision of, yes, I want to run the PowerShell command and either publish it globally or to the user as part of your scripting. There are some companies that are doing that. They just have boot scripts, you know, that just do all of the add and publishing every time it boots up.
Right. Okay. This is a somewhat lengthy one. Have you ever experienced situations where Citrix published applications loaded from AppV Management Server had problems with launching, which had to be resolved by manual-like publishing in Citrix Studio, often by using batch VBS scripting as launchers, or using the /app VBE parameter in order to launch the virtual environment?
I've seen a couple of different problems, and those are some of the things that I alluded to earlier that were problems with the CTX App Launcher. I think those things have been resolved in 7.13. I'm sure there's probably going to be some continuing problems out there with that, but all of the things that I'd seen in the past were really fixed that way. And so the things that we're talking about there are some of the workarounds that we were using to get past that problem. So we're basically taking CTX App Launcher out of the picture by manually getting it published down to the machine, and then just telling Citrix, as we were kind of discussing in the earlier one, telling Citrix, oh, hey, there's the executable to go run, and the AppV VBE parameter is one way to make sure that that gets start it up in a virtual environment. But if you're pointing to the AppV package share, it's gonna do that automatically for you. So you don't have to do that. You'd only have to do that for things like a virtualized Internet Explorer with a plugin. There you'd use the AppV VBE parameter. Some of the other problems I saw out in the field on that were things like if you had a package with multiple shortcuts in it, sometimes the process chain there would get the wrong application launching when the user launched the published application. And again, I think those problems are behind us. But if people are having additional problems, I'd love to hear about them.
Great. Do you have any good ways, Tim, to circle around or circumvent the AppV synchronization issues or troubleshooting tips? And this is in reference to a discussion about ZDesktop cannot start an application or AppV synchronization without throwing an error.
Yeah, well, I'd say get yourself on 7.13 and do the direct integration. So you're eliminating two problems. One, you're eliminating that synchronization portion of that completely. The second is you're going to get yourself on that newer CTX App Launcher. So I'd say you really want to get yourself upgraded at this point if you're still using the older versions. And if you're stuck on the older versions, you definitely want to hit up Citrix support and ask for the private fix for CTX App Launcher. That version isn't perfect, but it's a whole lot better than the one you have today.
Okay, if you have several applications inside a single AppV package and you want to publish them to separate user groups, is that possible or not when using the management / publication or publishing server?
It is possible using the publishing server. What you do is you bring the package in, and after you assign your original group, which would be referred to in that console as a default group, you tell it you want to create a custom group. And for those who are familiar with the external XML files, this would be the equivalent of a user-config.xml file. And once you've created the custom group, you assign that to your other user group. You can then go in and you can use the checkboxes on that interface to just turn off the applications that they're not supposed to have. So that would be the way that you would do that.
Nice. Is there any way that you can possibly know how to optimize the, and this is in quotes, the award-winning slowness, unquote, of loading applications from AppV Management Server into the Citrix Studio console when using the wizard to add an application or using the refresh option?
I'm going to go with no.
I
don't know of anything that you can do. I don't find it all that bad myself, but I guess their experience varies. Maybe they can contact Citrix support.
I'm going to skip over this one because it's really, really long and it's very specific to the SAP GUI. So Alex, I would suggest please go ahead and post that to the CUGC site once it's up and running, please.
SAP is horrible no matter how you go to deploy it.
Yes, exactly. I think you already addressed, which version of ZDesktop does AppV run best on, and I would say clearly the latest and greatest, right?
Certainly 7.11 or above, but 7.13, I know the launcher issues seem to be gone.
And of course, there's also the huge advantage of the North scale integration in terms of, just overall better efficiency.
Right.
Let's see. We have an AppV we have an AppV publishing management and reporting server. What is the correct configuration to use to publish packages via Studio, and still be able to use the reporting feature?
Okay. So the reporting feature is completely independent of anything else. What you want to do is you want to make sure, and I strongly suggest use the group policy ADMX to push the reporting configuration out. So that's where you would register the AppV client to know about the reporting server and when it should go report. Typically, it's going to upload stuff at night and bring that in. So it's completely independent. So whether or not you continue to use the dual admin mode or go to single admin mode, that's truly independent. One thing you do want to be aware of is any machine that is what I tend to refer to as semi-persistent. So this can mean non-persistent VDI, but also your XenApp servers. When those machines reboot, if you're looking at something like using PBS underneath, that reporting information that it caches goes away if it hasn't run. So as part of your shutdown script or logout script in the case of the VDI scenario, you want to put in a line there that runs the PowerShell commandlet to do a report run right then. So before it shuts down, it'll take that cached XML information, send it up to the report server, and then you'll have 100% of all of the data of every use of every application, which is what you really want there. Because then you can actually do license enforcement through that mechanism of making sure that everyone has a valid license, and if not, you go out and get it.
Sounds good. Stephanie, Tim, we still probably have a good 24 questions by my count. How long do you want to keep running here?
That I guess as long as everyone has time to stay for a little bit, that is great. We can get through a few more. If you need to leave, that's completely understandable, and just know that we will record this and you'll be able to hear the recording and see the rest of it. And also I put in the chat window a link to the forum thread, and that's where more questions can come in as well. So I guess Tim and Tobias, as long as you have time, maybe another 10-15 minutes.
I'm fine if you're good, Tim. Excellent.
Yeah,
all right.
Well,
let's
we see that attendee number drop out, then we'll just cut it off.
Yeah, I mean, we're still probably at about 85% of the original top count. So let's forge ahead. Thank you. Appreciate it. With the growing need of AppV packages in some account, how feasible is it to have a clean image every time you get a new package request?
I'm
not quite sure how to
sure what they mean. Okay, what I would say is that your sequencing best practice is to use a virtual machine with a snapshot. And every time you go to sequence a package, you revert to that snapshot so that you know you're on a clean machine. You really should be following that practice.
That sounds
and then something
reasonable.
else. Maybe they can type in another question to clarify.
Okay, I'll watch for that. Meanwhile, when sequencing, if an application has a dependency on Office, would you have Office on the sequencing machine, assuming Office is usually installed on the server and not delivered via AppV?
Okay. So in that scenario, you're going to have a native Office on the server, and you want to be doing, let's say an Excel plugin or something like that. When you're doing that work, yes, you would have your sequencer with Office installed. So typically, I talked about earlier, having that clean operating system with a snapshot there. Well, I might have another VM or a snapshot of that VM where I have Office installed as well. So I would go to that snapshot with Office installed, and then I would sequence that package. Now, if I was going to deliver Office virtually through an AppV package, we don't have to do that. Once we have our AppV package, we go into that clean VM that has no Office, and as part of doing the plugin, we point to that AppV package with Office, and it lays it down as if you had installed it. So that's the typical scenario that way, depending on which way you're doing. But for a lot of people, it's a native Office, and they're just trying to get these plugins in place for different users.
Okay, I think the answer to this is yes, but I want to hear your response. Can you install a 16-bit app on Windows 2008 32-bit and still deploy it to 2008 R2 64-bit?
It depends. Okay, so the answer is generally no. The 16-bit app isn't going to run on a 64-bit machine. However, if that 16-bit app is not a 16-bit Windows app, it's a 16-bit DOS app, we do have a technique where what you sequence is DOSBox with that application on your 32-bit machine, and now it will run on the 64-bit machine.
Ah, very interesting. Great, thank you. In single admin mode, how can you handle package publication inside a desktop session without using the receiver?
Do you understand what that question is?
No, not exactly.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what they're asking.
Okay, maybe Javier can
clarify that.
Add a clarification to that. Okay, for the AppV client VDA installation, you mentioned, Tim, a local account gets created during the process. What exactly is this account used for, and what permissions does it have on the system? The user is concerned primarily about existing group policies, overriding and possibly removing this local account.
Sure. The account is used for a comm service. And although my server isn't working, I can, as I talk, I can go in and we can see what that account is.
In fact, to that, addressing that, a user notes that your FTP is down and the AppV management tool is not available. So, whoops.
Yeah. My service provider made some changes last night to the FTP portion of the website, and it's knocked down about half of my website, and so far they're still trying to figure out who made the change. So we don't have a fix in place for my website at the moment.
Was it somebody at AWS?
No, unfortunately I use a low-cost provider. So anyway, yeah. So what we have in this case is we've got this local account that gets added when the VDA gets installed with the AppV client. It's strictly used for this one comm service, and the purpose of the comm service is, as part of that integration, to talk to the AppV client, to have the proper level of permissions. If you think about the user session coming in, standard users that don't have admin rights cannot add packages to the AppV client. That is something that requires elevation. So the technique that Citrix used was to have this comm service under a local account that has administrative rights, and that's what they're using it for. As to what else it can do, I'm not entirely sure. I really haven't looked into that. When I did my implementation, for example, I didn't do that. I simply used a Windows service and had the Windows service run under the standard local account so that then it had permissions. Just a different way of doing that implementation. So if I go, where am I going here? I'm going to find users, but this is Server 2016, so I'm looking in all the wrong places. So why don't you go ahead and start the next question? We'll find out who that user is.
Okay, sounds good, Tim. Can the AppV Manager check for conflicts between AppV packages?
Great question. And the answer is no. I've thought about that a little bit, but haven't really done anything in that regard. If this is something that they think is important to them, I'd encourage them to reach out to me and let me know the kind of scenarios that they're interested in. because maybe we can do something with that over time.
Okay, I hope you're still on, Wilkins. All right.
Okay, so this is that account, by the way. It's called CTX AppV Com Admin. So that's the local account that they're adding that they would have to be worried about.
Excellent, thank you. All right. Regarding a single admin without an AppV server, when is the package cached/mounted for the first time? Is it on the user launch, or is it launched immediately via the Studio console?
It's when the user launches. As part of their clicking on the application in storefront, the broker is going to communicate over, and that's the reason to use the single admin mode, is that it's only the one package that's going to have to cache at that point. Now, if the app is already there, if we're talking about Zen app, the app has a very good chance of already being there for another user, so it's really kind of a no-op when that happens. But that's also the reason why those machines, and again, as long as they're in the data center, we want to use shared content store mode, because then that caching doesn't really happen. It's just really adding the package and adding the knowledge of that, and the only thing that takes any time at all is the virtual registry mounting. And that's a piece that takes the most time when you're adding a package in. So a very large package, you feel that that delay a little bit more. But quite frankly, as I go to use Storefront, I'm launching natively installed applications, and I'm launching AppV apps that are the first time on that machine. And I don't really notice the difference for your run-of-the-mill applications. It takes long enough to get your session up that the difference is very small.
So only basically for the really large applications.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. There are some techniques, as we do, there are some pre-caching techniques that we do when we're not in that Citrix environment, as we're dealing with the AppV server, and when users are going with full desktops, we'll do some things to help speed things up there with some pre-caching scripts and stuff. But in that environment that they asked about, the single admin type of scenario there, it is what it is.
Right. Yeah, we've run into that some ourselves, actually, and in particular with like gigabyte-sized applications.
Mm-hmm. Actually, that's one of the things that we forgot to do, Tobias, because I know you just this last year spent a lot of time implementing, really, I think for the first time with AppV, right? And I was kind of hoping that maybe you might talk a little bit about your experience.
Oh, yeah. Chris, are you ready to?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, let me introduce my coworker, Christopher Bollins here. And go ahead, take it away, Chris.
All right, thanks, Tobias, and thanks, Tim. That was a lot of great information. My name is Chris Bollins. I'm a systems administrator at Northern Arizona University, and I work for the desktop computing and imaging service team. And I'm also a member of the Citrix customer advocacy program. So I was asked to talk today a little bit about Northern Arizona's implementation of AppV and give some insight as to the life cycle of the project and how it's worked out in our environment and continues to. So for those of you interested in implementing this technology in your environment, I hope the information here is useful. We don't yet have our Citrix environment integrated, but it's on the radar. So I just wanted to give a brief background about how the necessity for virtualized applications and distribution came about. About a year ago, NAU's infrastructure began to change drastically. The university president actually mandated that IT services be centralized. We previously were decentralized, and we had a lot of redundant services across the university. Those redundant services were managed by IT staff in their given areas, and there was not really any standards for how to handle software and image creation. So the scope of my team at the time before the centralization, it was pretty broad, but we primarily handled services related to students, such as imaging labs and kiosks. We we maintained a terminal server. We have a desktop environment, Zen desktop environment with about 350 VMs. We only had 8 unique PC images and a Mac image, and the size of the workload allowed us, with the help of our student workers, to create large full-featured images. So just fat images. We just threw all the software on there and tested them and put them out into production. After the centralization, though, our team was tasked with creating images for all departments and all colleges for the entire university. We have a pretty large university, roughly 25,000 at the Mountain campus, and we have extended campuses and such too. So we had a huge task ahead of us, and to kick off the process, we created a survey just using the Google Forms to gather information about unique software and images, and we sent that to those staff members that were previously working in those decentralized areas. And we also used Sassafras K2 key server audit and configuration manager reports to supplement our survey results. We were asking for quite a bit of information. We wanted to get that knowledge transfer as people moved into the new areas. It was kind of a long, drawn-out process, but in the end, we identified about 800 unique software titles, and it was abundantly clear that we needed some kind of solution to help us distribute and manage the vast software library. Our team originally looked into implementing a full implementation of AppV. I had built a test environment using Windows Server 2012 VM, and I put the reporting server and the distribution server and the management interface all on that same server. And we originally had a goal of coming up with a very vanilla image, and we just wanted to add a handful of commonly used applications across campus, such as browsers, plugins, and like the Office suite. We went through the learning process of how to sequence applications and what criteria made a particular software application a good candidate for AppV. Basically figuring out machine, does it have machine-based licensing or stuff like that. It was kind of a long process to figure that out. We used Windows 10 64-bit VMs to do all of our AppV sequencing. As Tim talked about a little bit earlier, we would sequence our application and revert the snapshot to a clean state. That worked out pretty well. We originally were using 8.1 VMs, and we were running the 5.1 sequencer, and we ran into some errors where we'd get a file path that was too long, and the sequencer would crash, and it would make us have to start over the whole process. But moving to the 5.2 sequencer with Windows 10 helped alleviate those issues. And after we tested our packages, we set up a DFS that we'd place our completed packages on. Early on, we did look at that product that was mentioned earlier, AppV Scheduler. It offered a lot of it offered a client-side only implementation of AppV with no full back-end infrastructure. The product had a lot of advanced caching options, and it was built with VDI and fat client environments in mind. Our environment was just a little too big, and it needed a more robust management interface, I think, for the size of what we were trying to do. And then also during that time, a colleague of mine, Timothy Cochran, came up with an in-house solution that utilized some custom group policy keys. Somebody was asking about that earlier, and it can be done. You can invoke the PowerShell scripts to deploy applications without infrastructure set up. You just need to sequence the application. So what we did is came up with custom group policy keys, and we just had flat file software lists, and we were able to apply those software lists to a specific AD and OU So, and that worked out all right, but we needed something more enterprise and something that had a better support model. So we're going to be distributing our AppV packages with SCCM, and our new CIO really wanted us to push to use SCCM. We decided that would be the best route to take. So over the last few weeks, our team has been testing AppV packages and creating those virtual environments and such, and it seems to be a good fit. So we're hoping to roll out on June 1st with that. So
sounds cool.
That's
great.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. You do earn a badge of honor. There aren't that many people that can crash the sequencer, so you're definitely up there.
Well, we did it regularly.
So you talked about going out with SCCM. So because I know you're also doing a lot with Citrix, I just want to check. Are you talking about SCCM to the Citrix machines?
No. So as I mentioned in the beginning, we haven't worked out any integrations with Citrix yet, but it is on the radar.
Yeah, because SCCM to any type of semi or non-persistent environment is typically a huge challenge because of the delays in getting the SCCM client to do its work after the user logs in, right?
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, often very long ones.
Great. Well,
the other lesson, I guess.
For sharing with us.
Yeah, the other quick lesson I think that we learned is providing servers that can, serve out the applications is really critical. And maybe, in fact, you can address this a little bit, Tim. Figuring out, how many instances do we really need in order to get, really good distribution. And what we are hoping is going to work is we've got, 3 servers right now. The coordination, the synchronization is all being done through DFS. And the cheapest way that we could come up with, doing this efficiently is we bought some of these 2 terabyte kind of general purpose SSD drives. And so we've set up 3 separate servers in 3 geographically diverse areas on campus so that hopefully, one, it'll provide better redundancy, and also through the luck of the draw, depending on which network they all go through in terms of, the subnetting and whatnot, that the load will hopefully distribute well and the I/O will be sufficient to fulfill our needs.
Mm-hmm. So we're talking, when you say server here, you're talking about file servers then, right?
File servers, yes.
Yeah, exactly, because that's where the performance concern would be. Going to SSD, wow, I mean, that's a huge benefit right there. Ultimately, the streaming speed is always end up being, dependent upon, the speed of being able to get stuff physically off of the disk over there. So SSDs is great. And then the networking in between, as well as, what are the endpoints. SMB is so much of a better protocol for streaming than SMB2 and SMB1 is. And of course, SMB3 you get by being, Windows 10 and Windows Server 2016 at each end. And if you're not, then you drop down. If you got a Windows 7 machine in there, it's going to be SMB2. So it'll be a little bit slower just because of that, right?
All right, great. Are you willing to field a few more questions here, Tim?
Yeah, I'm good for a little bit.
Okay. And thank you again, Chris, for your input. Much appreciated. Could you speak a little more, Tim, about PVS and AppV? Do you really need a persistent disk?
You don't have to, but if you don't, so first of all, if you're not going to put it on that persistent disk, you absolutely want to make sure that you're using the shared content store mode, because that'll cut down the amount of stuff that has to get cached into that AppV cache area. So with that on, what is it caching? Well, it's caching a placeholder for every file that's in your package, So that'll be, a little 4K turd, basically, that says, hey, I exist. And then the virtual registry file gets cached, so that's dependent on the size of the package. And then depending on how you sequence the package, our best practice in that case is that when you're in the sequencer, you do not launch the application and you do not do the checkbox on that special screen that says the fully cache the app. So as long as you do that, you'll get the minimum amount of information that needs to get cached into that area. And then that's just going to be part of your PBS write cache. And if you've got a big enough PBS write cache, then you're fine. That's something that's memory, right? But if that overflows, you start to see performance degradation on your server a little bit for just general purpose. So that's why we try to avoid that and usually drop that on a second persistent drive.
Okay, that makes total sense. Using the isolation environments that are available in 7.13, can you go through how that process works? They would like to use a single mode implementation with that functionality.
Sure. So the way that ends up working is you bring in the applications the same way you would, and then you create this virtual isolation environment. And when you're setting up the virtual isolation environment, what you're basically saying is that here are a set of applications, and if the user launches any one of these applications, any of the other applications that are assigned to them will be brought into this group. And as part of that whole process with the CTX App Launcher, it'll locally create that connection group on the fly and then add each of the applications that are needed. So it's dependent, again, upon which ones have been are part of that user's delivery group, even though you define the isolation group with maybe a fuller set of that. Does that make sense?
Does to me. Thank you.
Okay, good.
How do you go about deploying an AppV package inside a Unidesk layer?
How do you go about deploying an AppV package inside a Unidesk layer?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we could be talking about a couple of different things. One is something that I've never considered before. So let's say I create a Unidesk layer, and as part of creating that layer, I copy the AppV file into there. So that AppV file then looks like C:some path, but it's still the AppV file. If you did that when you are at the client, interesting. So if I forget about Citrix integration for a second, or was thinking about this on the fly, without Citrix integration, at the AppV client, I can just run a PowerShell commandlet, and rather than reference a UNC share, I'm just referencing a local share for the add package, and then everything works just fine. If I'm doing that through Studio, I would have to have it look at a VDA machine that has that Unidesk layer added, and then it would then, you would be able to look to that as the source for as you add the package into Studio itself. And yeah, I suppose that would work. I'm not sure I'd want to do that, but sure, I suppose it could work. The other thing that could be talked about here is in kind of pre-caching. And I can tell you the truth, I really don't like pre-caching because of the maintenance aspects of it. But certainly as part of either your master image or a layer, you could create the AppV cache and include it in that layer and have the AppV client just pick it up. Now the issue with that is that you'll have the files in place. You still need to do the add and publish pieces that Citrix is going to do for you anyway. And it'll just kind of be redundant. It won't need to actually cache anything because it'll already be there as part of that image. And that's a possibility. And by the way, this discussion does remind me, if you want to put the AppV client in Unidesk layer, it needs to be one of those boot layers, because it does include device drivers, so that's where you would put it.
Is that going to change, you think, significantly as Unidesk gets incorporated eventually directly into Citrix?
I don't know. I think that, if you think about Unidesk, I mean, they're still, even though they're part of Citrix, they're still really in that mindset of being a separate vendor, and they spent the last 3 years competing against AppV, and it might take a little more time for them to get in the idea of cooperating quite that much, but we'll see what happens.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What's the downside of not having a publishing server with the newest version of XenApp and XenDesktop?
Assuming that you're not going to try to push also out to physical desktops, none. There is no downside.
Well, that's nice and straightforward. For a single admin, can you set your own dynamic configuration XML? And can you, I guess this means regulate somehow from the console if the package will be published globally or only to a particular user set?
Got it. Okay, so two separate questions here. The first one, no, you cannot specify an external XML file for the dynamic configuration. However, as of the 5.1 version of the sequencer, they opened up the ability to edit the manifest file that's internal to the package. So all of the things that you could do on the external deployment config.xml file, we now recommend doing inside the package. So the way that works is you go through the sequencer, and when you get to the sequence editor, the multi-tabbed interface at the end, there's a button there that will export the manifest.xml file, and it'll put that XML file out externally. You can then edit that, and I mean, you can use Notepad. I've got a free tool called AppV Manifest Editor that'll give you a GUI to keep you from breaking your package, because the XML is very picky. But you can go in there and do any of the things you want to do, which is typically things like putting in scripts. That's mostly what people are doing. But you can do all that editing there and then import it back into the sequencer and now save your package off. And now you don't need the external file. And that's really the best way to do that these days. The second part of that question was about trying to get global publishing through Studio. And you just can't do that today. I'm not sure whether or not it's something that Citrix is looking at to help solve, but certainly the more feedback they get from the user community, the more likely they are to produce something there.
Great. Thank you so much. Does Citrix Studio 7.13 support the /AppV VE switch? Because the older Studio version 7.8, for example, does not support running IE Explorer with that switch or any local installed applications.
Okay. So I'll say two things. The first thing I'll say is, and I'll say three things. All right, fine. I lied. Three things. The first thing I'll say is that for some of those uses, there is another feature of AppV we really didn't talk about called Run Virtual, and that would be the correct way to solve that problem. Run Virtual is a registration that you would give to say something like, if Internet Explorer runs, I want it to run in this virtual environment. So it would be the same argument you'd put on the AppV VDE switch, but you just throw it into a registry, and now you don't worry about that happening dynamically. That's not the right solution for every scenario, but for a lot of the stuff with IE, you create a dummy IE plugin package and you do that, so that anytime IE runs, that package starts up. And now, with the single admin and the isolation groups, you just publish out the groups, and then they'll get all of the packages in that group running in IE, no matter what they do. And we don't have to worry about the AppV VDE. Second thing I'll say is that we can, as part of the package creation, not go directly to the Internet Explorer, whatever the application is that you need that switch on, but instead you have a shortcut in the package that points to a script that then does that for you. And so you do your first part that gets you into the virtual environment, and then it launches the part that you need. And that's a reasonable solution with what you have today. There's nothing in the console that will allow you to do that. If you really need to do that, that's the third part of the answer that I remembered, which is if you do something to get the AppV package down to that client through some other method, whether that's a scripting method to put it on the package, similar to the way you would add something to the master image, or using the AppV server with some publishing in a not quite the right way you should do it, but it would work and solve this problem for you way, you would be able to go in and have that package there. And now in Studio, you know, when you point to a command line, you can add the command line arguments, and you can put the AppV VDE there. But that's a very unusual case, and I don't really look. If someone's looking to do that, they probably should be looking at the other methods first to see if they can solve the problem.
Sounds good. How are we doing time-wise? Is everyone ready to drop from exhaustion, or?
Yeah, I'd say we're at 2:40. So what we can do is put the rest of the questions, Tim, if I send you the list of questions and the ones that, I don't know how you'll know which ones you got to, maybe you'll remember. I can put some of them in the forum.
Okay. Well, there may be something I get to that I can fix my answers to too. You never know.
Well, we got up to about 10:49 is where basically the cutoff is in questions. So essentially, I've been going sequentially because, interestingly enough, there's been essentially no overlap, which is pretty unusual. So a lot of really good and very detailed questions. But I think at this point we probably need to wrap up in the interest of time. So I will start by saying many, many thanks to Tim for your time and your valuable contributions, and much appreciated. Also, all the online work that you're providing through CUGC and through your own publications, and also a thanks to Chris Bollins, my coworker, for his evaluation of where we are right now here at Northern Arizona University. And with that, I'll pass it back to Stephanie.
All right. Well, again, thank you so much. That was a great presentation. I learned a lot. I'm sure everyone else did too. And just remind everyone that you'll get a link to the recording sometime tomorrow. We'll have it posted on mycugc.org as well. And there'll be a link to a very, very short anonymous survey in there. We'd love to hear your comments and suggestions and your feedback. And please visit mycugc.org and find out what else is going on in the community. We'd love to have you out there. There's special interest groups. You can find your local group, go to some local meetings, and just get involved. And with that, I'll thank Tim and Tobias and Christopher, and hope that everyone has a great afternoon, evening, or rest of your day. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.